reports of the Russian commander Sergei Kisel that he may have been dismissed from command. I should say that these reports, for the time being, come to us through Russian bloggers and Ukrainian military intelligence. So they seem very likely, but they could turn out to be false still. But this was a man who he was himself redeployed to Syria after an ignominious end to his campaign in Ukraine. He was part of the unit that was pushed back from Kharkiv in the counteroffensive a couple of years ago.
Well, first of all, just bring us up to speed, if you can, with the events of recent days in Syria and in Aleppo in particular. What's been happening?
So we're at the end of a few days of what's been a lightning strike by the Syrian rebels. These are the Turkish-backed Syrian rebels in the north, who are mostly dominated by a single group. I think we'll have a bit of time to talk about them in more detail in a second. Over the space of really just a few days, Aleppo, which was taken by government forces about 8 years ago, at a loss of tremendous life and a massive amount of damage, has been retaken by opposition forces in just a few days, who have swept from the western suburbs of the city right across the city into the eastern suburbs, and are now continuing to push south, threatening the next major city in Syria, which is Hama, after which there is Homs and Damascus. So this is a major shift in what had previously been really a frozen conflict in a long-running civil war, but one which hasn't moved quickly for really the last decade.
And as you mentioned, this group is a group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Tell us about them. Who are they and what are they fighting for?
So initially, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was a splinter group from Al-Qaeda. They initially went by Al-Nusra Fronts, which before ISIS was the big threatening Islamic group as part of the opposition that the Syrian government used to hold up as evidence of the legitimacy of their fight. Since then, in the last 7 years almost, the group has undergone a kind of rebranding where they've disavowed Al-Qaeda and their very extremist roots, and have even at times clashed with other Al-Qaeda splinter groups. That said, there is definitely an Islamist thread through this group. It's not that they've suddenly disavowed all notions of what Al-Qaeda itself stood for. And it should also be recognised as well, which has gone unrecognised through other chapters of the Syrian civil war. It's not clear that this is one unified group who is invading Aleppo and is taking the rest of the country. There are other groups which are affiliated to HTS, other groups which may be only very loosely affiliated, and other people who may be on the outskirts of the two. So it's not necessarily one homogenous force that's moving in. It does seem to be characterised predominantly by HTS. So that's the name that we're going to hear much more of in the coming weeks.
And as you mentioned, the Syrian civil war, yes, it's been ongoing since 2011 pretty much, but it's essentially been a frozen conflict in recent years. So why have things flared up now?
I think the calculation might be that now is as good a time as ever to strike. So Russia, which has been Syria's main backer, or one of its main backers, is for the time being at least bogged down in Ukraine. Now, whether that changes with an incoming Trump presidency, it may well do. Iran is still reeling from the knock-on effects of the Hezbollah-Israel war, which is in a sense ongoing. There's a ceasefire, but it's a fragile ceasefire, and there are still hostilities in Lebanon. And Hezbollah itself, which has come to the aid of the Assad regime and has stepped in and has defended the city of Homs in particular, which I mentioned before. I'm speaking to you from Lebanon, and I do not see much desire amongst Hezbollah supporters, given the destruction which has been already wreaked on Beirut and the rest of the country, to send their fighters abroad to defend Bashar al-Assad, who didn't step in to defend Lebanon from Israel. So I think the opposition forces may feel that now is the time to strike, that Assad is looking weaker than he's looked for many years, and potentially weaker than he'll look for many years to come. It could still be that Russia manages to rally its forces, to draw down its commitments in Ukraine. Hezbollah might have a chance to regroup, same with Iran. So they may want to take this opportunity, which perhaps it might not repeat itself.
What about the Russian response? I mean, we've seen airstrikes launched by Russia in Syria over the weekend since this attack. And now there's even reports that Vladimir Putin has fired, essentially, the head of the Russian military mission to Syria. So what's going on there?
Well, Russia is continuing to fight for Assad, as it has for years since the civil war erupted. Like you say, there have been airstrikes against opposition held areas around Aleppo and around Idlib. It's interesting, the reports of the Russian commander, Sergei Kisel, that he may have been dismissed from command. I should say that these reports, for the time being, come to us through Russian bloggers and Ukrainian military intelligence. So they seem very likely, but they could turn out to be false still. But this was a man who he was himself redeployed to Syria after an ignominious end to his campaign in Ukraine. He was part of the unit that was pushed back from Kharkiv in the counteroffensive a couple of years ago. So we'll see how far Russia is prepared to commit at this point for its ally. It's obviously massively committed itself to Ukraine. It's not like 2015, 2016. Whether or not he's replaced by a commander who is able to galvanize Russian forces and really make a concerted effort to push back the rebels and retake Aleppo, we'll see. But this is part of the Russian calculation as well, and it's part of what makes this situation so interesting.
And why does Vladimir Putin have such a strong alliance with Bashar al-Assad? I mean, if you're Vladimir Putin currently, as you say, he's got his own problems to worry about in terms of the war in Ukraine. Why does he feel the need to maintain this alliance in Syria when, frankly, he probably would be better off, from his perspective, using those resources elsewhere?
Right. Well, one of the tangible reasons, and this is something you'll see cropping up a lot, is that Russia has a very important naval base in Syria. It's its only Mediterranean base, if you exclude Crimea, and obviously at the time there was less Russian presence in the Black Sea as there is now. But Vladimir Putin has always had an interest in projecting Russian power across the world, beyond Russia's own borders. And Bashar al-Assad and Syria have been a key ally for them in the Middle East. I think it's a show of Russian commitment to foreign policy. It's a show of Russia's commitment particularly to the Middle East. They, at this point, won't want to be seen to retreat from it. So there are tangible interests there in Syria, but there's also this less tangible sense of Russia power projection. It will be a humiliating withdrawal to have to leave now.
So what do you think happens next? I mean, obviously that's the kind of $1 million question, but do you think the Assad regime has a realistic chance of regaining control of Aleppo and reasserting its authority?
We'll see what happens in the coming days. I think it's careful. We should be careful not to assume that this offensive is going to continue. I was speaking to somebody earlier who thinks that maybe the rebels too are surprised by the progress they've made in such a short space of time. Like we just said, this is a conflict that's been frozen for ages. And at various points over the long-running civil war, we've seen one side with the upper hand up against and then that switched to the other side. And neither has been able to take full control of the country. I think the chance that they will continue on and take Damascus, of course it's possible. I think it's not necessarily likely in the short term. Equally, the chance that Assad is able to rally his forces and retake Aleppo, like I said before, it came last time at a huge loss of life, at a huge cost, a huge number of military resources. What's equally likely, I think, is that we slip back into a state of the front lines kind of becoming a stalemate between the two forces, or not two forces, because there are more than two forces. Sadly, I think the only prediction that we can make right now is that more people will continue to suffer as a result of the war. There will be more homes destroyed and more lives lost. But to what end, it remains unclear.
And just finally, put this into kind of global context for us. Why does this matter? I mean, you mentioned that this isn't just about Syria. Russia, Iran, Hezbollah all have a kind of stake here. What is the wider global significance of what is flaring up again now in Syria?
Right. Well, Syria has always had a global significance in terms of this war, much to the dismay of Syrians who've seen people from various countries either directly fighting in Syria or supporting others who are fighting in Syria. For Iran, this raises the specter of it becoming increasingly isolated at a time when it's already isolated, and at a time when incoming Trump administration is likely to heighten that isolation. So for them, this would be a significant step back if Assad was to be pushed back. Similarly, for Russia, as we've mentioned, it will be a loss of credibility on the global stage. It will be a loss of opportunity for them to engage in power projection beyond their own borders. It has, and all of these have effects on other conflicts that we're following, obviously in Ukraine and Lebanon and Israel and Gaza and the wider Middle East as well. And kind of less tangibly, other similar situations such as China's ambitions in Taiwan. This is the latest chapter in what we've seen in the last few years, which are these big clashes between superpowers in various parts of the world.